You're all very welcome to the US launch of the Cambridge Centenary Ulysses, edited by Professor Catherine Flynn. And as many of you probably won't have seen the book, let me try and show it to you here. Here it is in all its £7 glory. Now, let me briefly introduce the panel before stepping aside. Ambassador Daniel Mulhall will be known to many of you for his work on a quite amazing range of Irish fronts. This year, those fronts included the publication of Ulysses, A Reader's Odyssey. That book immediately became a bestseller in Ireland and was reviewed widely and warmly, including in the TLS. In the fall, Ambassador Mulhall becomes Distinguished Professor of Irish Studies at NYU, and in January, he is Parnell Fellow at Magdalen College, Cambridge. Each year, I visit the small coastal town of Tramore in County Waterford, population around 10,000. Dan is from Waterford. Some of his family live in Tramore. Such is the pride in Waterford in Dan's many extraordinary achievements that each year in Tramore, about 15,000 people tell me that they know him well. With all demands on his time, we're extremely grateful to him for being part of this event today. Vince Sherry is Howard Nemiroff Professor in the Humanities and Chair of the English Department at Washington University, St. Louis. A distinguished scholar of modernism and the literature of World War I, he has a lifelong investment in Joyce. In fact, his family are from Dublin, and once ran a pub called the Gay Companion, a pub clearly anticipating important constitutional amendments. About 15 years ago, Vince told me he'd read Ulysses 25 times, so soon will we need a panel to celebrate his 50th reading of the novel. Vince was a supporter of this project from an early stage and saw all its potential. He chairs today's event and has our gratitude once again for his input into the list. Now, the undisputed star of today's event. Catherine Flynn is Associate Professor at the University of California, Berkeley. She grew up in County Cork, completed a Bachelor of Architecture at University College Dublin, practiced architecture in Vienna, for a BA in English and Philosophy at Cork, then onto a PhD at Yale. After a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford, she became Professor in the English Department at Berkeley, itself a notable achievement. Her first book, James Joyce and the Matter of Paris, CUP 2019, traces Joyce's evolving art as a response to consumer capitalism, drawing on 19th century avant-garde French literature and Catherine's understanding of Dublin as a modern European city. And as everything Catherine does for CUP turns to gold, it is, of course, a best-selling academic title. It's a huge pleasure for me professionally and personally to have this opportunity to say publicly how much we, CUP, the contributors, the readers of this already best-selling book, and I just got an email 15 minutes ago saying it's #1 in the Republic's fiction charts, which is an extraordinary achievement, how much we owe to Catherine Flynn. This edition reflects her capacious knowledge, her calm professionalism, her passion for Joyce, the esteem and affection she is held in by the Joyce community, and her steely intellectual command of everything such a sizable project entails. She has put heart and soul and a very big brain into it, and it's worked. It was #1 on Amazon.com and Amazon.uk in various categories before it was published, and we sold out the first print run almost immediately in Ireland and the UK, the advance orders for the US are just great. During Bloomsday Week, Catherine was, like the narrator in Ulysses, everywhere throughout Dublin, though definitely not unseen, with events at Hodges Figgis, the Museum of Literature in Ireland, the Joyce Conference, RTE Radio. The book was reviewed in the Irish Times, plus she had a column there. She was a multimedia event. Catherine, for all that and for making this book possible, on behalf of the press and from me personally, thank you. We are in your debt. So as we virtually gather to celebrate the US launch of the Cambridge edition of Ulysses, from New York City, I raise a rhetorical glass to the people who have made today possible, Vince and Dan, Catherine and our contributors, and of course, Joyce. We thank them all. Vince.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. I'm really glad to be here today to serve in this mediating role. I'm grateful to the ambassador for joining us as one of the Joyceans, and as Dan, and to Catherine, of course, for all the work she did to get us here for today. And as Edgar said earlier, after we've got this conversation going, you can be sending your comments, questions into the Q&A, and I'll try to filter them in as I can. So Catherine, in your wonderful introduction to this volume, you note that Ulysses both appeals and intimidates, okay? will fascinate but also frustrate readers. Okay, sometimes, you know, in more or less equal measures, each side lifting and reinforcing the other. We want to know, we know more, we realize what we don't know, we want to know. It keeps opening up. I think of this in a less sort of grandiose way, as Huck Finn sidling out of that church, muttering to himself after the sermon, "The statements was interesting, but tough." That's a problem you've taken on, Dan, in your recent Reader's Odyssey, companion to Ulysses. It's a companion that is sure to expand the novel's readership beyond the narrower, though it's not so narrow anymore, as the sales figures indicate, the narrow academic readership of this book. And that book, yours, joins in your longer experience in bringing Ulysses into the world, in your diplomatic travels, sometimes in diplomatic channels. So I'm wondering, I'd like to get us started by asking you, what have been for you the major challenges in bringing Ulysses into this wider reception area? And can you see anything in this new edition that might, you know, further the work you've been doing all along with it?
What I've discovered really over the last 44 years of my diplomatic career is that we in Ireland have an enormous resource in the form of our writers, which attract people to us in ways that other aspects of our work wouldn't achieve the same effect. So, for example, if I hold a Bloomsday event here, I will get senior people to turn up. And I remember once I had a Supreme Court judge here last year at our Bloomsday event, and he said to me afterwards, he said, "I never got Joyce before, but now I do." So that kind of exposure of someone of that caliber, you know, obviously a serious person, a reader, but actually decided that he got Joyce because he heard and saw what we were doing at our Bloomsday event, which is trying to make it accessible to a wider audience. So that's always been my goal, has been to use Ulysses and Joyce's work generally as a way of communicating with people from other backgrounds and other cultures. And so, for example, in India, there I used mainly a portrait of the artist as a young man, because I talked about, in a speech I gave there many years ago, I talked about the nets of language, religion, and nationality. Because guess what? They were relevant to India in the 1980s, just as they were to Ireland in Joyce's time. I remember in Germany 10 years ago or more, at my Bloomsdays there, I always focused on that line, "What is your nation, if I may ask, Mr. Bloom?" "Ireland, I was born here, Ireland." And I made the point to Germans, and they readily recognized the power of this point, that if you had had that definition of German nationality in the 20th century, you would have been spared some of the horrors that your country had to endure as a result of having a much more confined notion of nationality, which couldn't accommodate, for example, people of Jewish origin who were born in Germany and in many cases were generations located in Germany and spoke German and were part of German culture. So I think everywhere you go, I found, at least, there's a different message to be conveyed by Ulysses. And this year I've been talking in particular about the line about force, hatred, and history and all that, because what does that do? It chimes with the current situation in Ukraine, where force, hatred, and history are on the rampage, and where the whole world is now being churned by these forces that Joyce correctly pushed back against through Leopold Bloom 100 years ago.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, so all of these touchstones in the novel for problems perennial and contemporary. And it's such a political novel in that sense. It's not political position taking, but addressing the political as a condition of history and of existence, and of working into and through that, not with policy, but with, I think you've appreciated yourself, Bloom's own ability to just keep going through an otherwise staggering day, and reaching a point of equanimity.
And the other thing I focused on recently as well is Bloom's absolute lack of narcissism. Whereas, today, I suppose one of the problems that we face is this sort of narcissism appears to be on the rise, and it's giving rise to political consequences in various places. But Bloom is the one who even when he's faced with his wife's infidelity, thinks about the fact that there are actually other crimes far worse than infidelity, and he lists a whole bunch of them, and then he says, anyway, the stars don't care, so why should I? And so he gets into his bed and snuggles up beside Molly, and all is well in the world. So I think that's also a lesson for today's rather heated world. And I also like the description of Bloom as in The Oxen and the Sun as Mr. Cautious Calmer. And I think these days we might need a Mr. Cautious Calmer. And I like the idea as well in Eumaeus, where he talks about having to look at both sides of the story and weigh up things. So I think of Bloom now as a kind of a representative of centrist politics, which I think we probably need a bit more of now in various parts of the world, where the center seems to have been disrupted by populist forces on both sides.
Well, thank you. So I'm wondering, Catherine, if there's anything in that that long list of useful aspects of Ulysses that speaks to you from either in theory or in practice, about Ulysses as a book that's in the world, and it represents or presents literature in the world, and seems to speak to you for reasons such as Dan cites there.
Yeah. Thank you, Vince, and thank you, Dan. It's so nice to be in this conversation with you today. It's such a happy occasion. So, responding to that last question, Vince, and to your first one about, how Ulysses challenges us, and it's a difficult book. It frustrates us, but it fascinates us, and it gives us pleasure. And your suggestion that these two are kind of bound up together, I think is really apt. There's so much of our contemporary moment that is consumable. And I say this in the introduction. There's so much that is, ready to be swallowed without any thought or any effort. And Ulysses is the very opposite of that. And it's constantly challenging us. And everything is challenged. So, we're at a moment now where we're really rethinking Irishness, for example. And this is why Ulysses is a very helpful book for us, because that discussion of the nation, what is a nation, Bloom has asked, and he gives two answers that are really in opposition to one another. More fundamentally, they're in opposition to an idea of ethnic nationalism, of blood and soil, racy of the soil. And this really, I think, speaks to a lot of us today, a lot of Irish people and people in other countries too, who are really thinking about what it means to come together in a state, and how that might be meaningful for everyone in the state, as well as the minorities, of whom Leopold Bloom is one. But, I think that this is just one example of how Ulysses takes things that seem self-evident. Irishness, like in 1922, Irishness was achieved in some way that took, a huge amount of struggle and was a question. And Ulysses is able to pose that question, or Joyce can pose that question through Ulysses at a moment when it's very bold to do that, when it's very bold to say, this is something that's in progress, actually. And so this is just one example of how this book presents us with all kinds of understandings that are works in progress. What it is to be an individual, what it is to be part of a community, what it is to be in a relationship, in a marriage, what it is to belong to somewhere and to know a city, and what it is to read a book. Fundamentally, Ulysses presents us with that challenge. And so this is why it really is an odyssey for the reader, where they start off pretty disorientated, as we say here in Ireland, or disoriented in the States, and it just gets more and more intense, but more and more enjoyable. And I think you and I were talking about this before, how it's actually, as the episodes get more involved, that readers, students, all kinds of readers find them more satisfying, the more they're at sea, the stranger it gets, the more people love it, because it's an adventure, and they feel their edges growing, their boundaries, their horizons growing as readers and as thinkers. And I think even as people, this is a book that can really help you push yourself into new ways of thinking and feeling. And that, I think, is something that is really welcome for us at this moment.
Right, and sort of reversing the somewhat conventional trajectory of moving from problem to resolution. I think this novel begins with the apparent clarities and then goes on to complicate them by living them and living them from the inside out. So along that, on a more particular angle to what you were just saying, Catherine, about reading the novel. And over to you, Dan. In your recent book, you acknowledge a kind of special readership for this novel, a sort of a semi-readership. It's the readers who have started the novel, but never finished it.
Yeah.
And yet there's a special place for them. I think it's certainly clear, and I've taught the book probably 30 times on its own. You realize that it's not an end-driven novel. Okay. It's not a page turner, but the word Odyssey in your own title implies, if not a line through, at least a sailing on. All right, we move forward on it. So another way of thinking about this, and this is how I want to frame the question for both of you. If we forego any obvious involvement in resolving a plot or motivating a narrative, we can get more intensely connected to the experience of reading as reading, the sheer experience of reading, a kind of minute by minute, inch by inch, engagement with the text. We get embedded in the text in the same way that the perspective of the novel is an embedded perspective. It comes from the inside out. It's living from the inside out. It's speaking from the inside out. There's not a narrator saying, well, here's this building on O'Connell Street, and it had this history and that. We get the reception of that building as it's filtered through the mental and emotional and even biological experience of the characters in voice in the novel. So I'm wondering, that you too, in your introduction, Catherine, it's a feature you appreciate too, the embeddedness of the perspective. So look, anyone's experience in rereading a book is different. And we say Ulysses is never read, it's only reread. But here we've been given a chance to reread this book in a new edition. And here's what I want to ask each of you: like, how does this new edition affect your experience in reading the book as just a reading experience? What's it like for you that in reading? What's the same as of old, and what might be new? So Dan, could you start?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I first read the book, or tried to read it, failed, but tried at least, in the summer of 1974, and that was just the book, the American edition, the 1960 edition, or whatever it was. And I had no aid at all. I had, you couldn't even. That was the days before Google, and so I didn't have So I really struggled because I didn't have a support system. Now, eventually, when I read the book again, I read it with a guide. I can't remember which guide I used, but that was back in the 80s and then in the 90s again. So I've had a number of immersions in the book of different kinds. And of course, the last few years in writing my book, I have a library here. I could show it to you. I have a full shelf of books that I acquired about Joyce's novel. And so I read the book informed by those. But what I would say is that this book is a new bit of guidance that's available. In other words, you pick this book up and you can read, first of all, you read the introductory chapter by Catherine, and then you read the individual introductions, and then you read the episode, and then you get, on every page, you get some help with understanding some of the complexities of it. So for me, at least, that is a different reading experience from the one I had in 1974 in my student accommodation in Kansas City at the University at Rockhurst College in Kansas City, reading it with no help. So this is a new helper. This is a kind of this is a piece of support that's now available, and it's the latest piece of support, and it reflects the latest thinking about Ulysses, which I'm sure will be overtaken in 10 or 20 years' time. But for the moment, this is the kind of accumulation of the views of those who are currently engaged in the study of Joyce's novel, and that's why I think it's a worthwhile experience. And I haven't read the whole of the book, but I've read a number of episodes that I was particularly interested in. I mean, I'm going to be teaching at NYU in the fall, and I'm not going to teach Ulysses. I'm going to teach 2 episodes. I'm going to teach Cyclops and Eumaeus, because I'm teaching a history course, and I'm going to use those 2 episodes to enlighten the issues to do with the history of Ireland in the early 20th century.
So could you speak to that, Catherine? Like how you obviously put the text together, but you put it together as a reader. I'm wondering how this feels the same and how it feels different for you.
Yeah. So over the years, since I started working on Ulysses in my dissertation, I mean, I read it in Cork first. I tried to read it in London, in Dublin, and then I read it at UCC, actually, in a class with Cobra Carney, but the whole thing. But, so many people had said to me, I tried to read Ulysses, but I failed. Or I wanted to read it, but it was just too intimidating. I had to look and I gave up. So this book is for them. But it's also for people who know Ulysses. And there are various things to help different readers at different stages. So in one way, it's about, attacking Ulysses like it's a series of mountain ridges, mountain peaks, where you get through each episode, and then you have an essay by Joyce. I'm so grateful to the Joyce scholars who've written these essays. They all did an amazing job. And each one of them provides kind of sustenance for the reader, a summary of the plot, a discussion of the most important literary and historical references, an explanation of the parallel with the Odyssey, but which is really a set of questions, actually, because Joyce is always bouncing off Homer's Odyssey. He's never just translating it. There's always something creative and something, questionable or mysterious that's going on, debatable. And then also they offer readings that they set within some of the most important readings, over the course of readings of Joyce. So you get a sense of the history of reception of the episode, but they all have a very light touch. All these essays are written to be read by anyone. And so this is, a book that kind of gives you a sense of where people are now, but it also gives you a sense of the discussion up till this point, the 100 years that Joyce talked about, of scholars puzzling. Maybe he said that, maybe he didn't.
It was 1,000 years, I think.
1,000 years, exactly, a millennium. And so, but another thing that I've built into the book is Joyce himself is a reader of the text, correcting things. So his corrections are in the margins and in the footnotes to every page, along with the explanatory footnotes, what does a particular word mean, or what phrase is referring to what, say, Shakespeare play, are a set of references to Hans Walter Gabler's famous 1980s edition, the one that has supposedly 5,000 corrections of the first edition. And so I put a lot of those are to do with punctuation that doesn't impact very powerfully on the meaning, but I include a whole set of references to his corrections that are interesting. And so as a reader, often I've found when I'm reading the first edition or any other edition, I wonder, what does Gabler have here, and because they're very interesting inclusions. And so you can look back and forth between the different versions and get a sense of the history of reception of the text. And I think that's a very interesting thing, because the Joyce's book then it reveals its dynamic nature. And this, this edition doesn't set out to be the perfect edition. Instead, it intends to give you a sense of the history of Joyce's text, and for Joyce himself too. And so there's an essay on the back that I co-wrote with Ronan Crowley, who's an expert in genetic criticism, about the history of the text and the reason why it was so flawed when it came out, and also why it became even more flawed over the years as various people attempted to correct it. But so the reading experience is a dynamic one. You know, the frame is dynamic, and then it intends to support the reader as they're grappling in a dynamic way with whatever sentence they're rereading, to use your word. You know, that they're coming from, because they're coming to again because either they've read the book before or they know that sentence from somewhere else. You know, like they've come across the phrase in a play by Shakespeare that they had to read in school, or that they saw a film adaptation of, or because it's circulating in popular discourse. So that is what Joyce was taking many of his references from, just the way that people speak. Yeah, songs, operas, all kinds of, you know, popular books, catchphrases, everything is recirculated in Ulysses.
I think in the history of its reception, it's 100 years of fame or infamy. You know, it acquires the status of this hermetic text that has all these, you know, like, you know, deeply secret meanings that you need, you know, mythic codes to decode. Whereas so much of it is when you look at an annotation, you see that so much of it is local reference. It's the day in the life of Dublin. And to go back to the beginning of this last exchange, you know, I think people probably all remember their first experiences reading Ulysses, like where they were at a certain kind of cataclysmic day in history. Like for some reason, you know, it fell into my lap when I was about 16 years old. I'm Irish Catholic family. I was in a Jesuit high school. Joyce was in the rangefinder. And I somehow just laid hold of Ulysses. I think I wasn't smart enough to not finish it. I mean, I would put it this way. I did not know that I was not supposed to understand it. Okay. So it was like my world with an interesting difference. And I wasn't like pressuring sentences or phrases. I was just sort of swimming in the sea of its language. And I think that first experience of encountering it and the kind of happy bafflement of that experience is really important. When I teach the book, I do a course on Ulysses by itself, and for the first 3 weeks, I ask the students just to read it through. No guides, no helpers. Okay, just enter it, and don't fill out any course evaluations on this course while you're doing that. Okay. And then we come back and do it, as it were, rereading it chapter by chapter. And that reread, just the experience of having gotten through it, all right, and having some very impressionistic, indeed emotional sense of what's going on in this book, you know, almost below the radar of conscious knowledge, is an enormous help. So that's what I think we come to your edition with. And then, you know, most of us probably in this webinar are rereaders of the book. And that's why I wanted to ask us for the next question, to look at an actual piece of a page of this new edition. Edgar, could you get that up on the screen so that everyone can see this? And I think you know, Catherine, you kind of detailed the features of each page. You know, at the center of it, we've got the printed edition of 1922, and to the side, we've got a record of Joyce's corrections to the text, as well as line number references to the Gabler edition. And at the bottom, those annotations of specific words and phrases. At the top, the chapter title, referencing the corresponding episode in the Odyssey. I think it's all constellated together in a way that has never been done before. At least I certainly don't recognize it, maybe not even dreamt of. So I'm wondering, Dan, could you speak to the way this, just looking at the page, what that page does to a reading experience? Okay, we were just talking about what it's like to read this book inch by inch, but how about page by page? What does this do to our, like, this composited
Yeah.
gathering of stuff do for our reading experience.
You know, I mean, I often use the you know, the Penguin student edition, which has, but in that case you have to keep flicking back and forth, so it doesn't really encourage you to actually explore the meaning when you're reading page by page. So what I could recommend here is that, you know, you could even read this book by sort of every night for a period of time. Just pick out a page and read the page and read the, you know, the marginal notes and then the notes at the bottom. And I think that would give you a kind of a whole new, it's a bit like reading, I often read a poem before I, you know, before I turn in for the evening, and I usually pick out some lines from my daily Irish poetry tweet that I put out every morning. But I usually, you know, find the piece of poetry. So I read a poem and find a little piece to tweet the following morning. So I think you could use this book the same way. In other words, take it page by page, and you don't even necessarily have to read each page in sequence, because each page has its own magic to it. And I think part of the value of Catherine's work and the work of the other people involved is that magic comes across on a single page, instead of having to flick back and forth to the back of a student edition and find the annotation concerned, or indeed have your annotated guide, or have your annotation, you know, in a separate book. This is just an extremely easy and flexible way of accessing the text and commentaries on the text, which will lift the text from the page and enable the average reader, which is what I always think of the average reader, not, you know, I mean, not the kind of advanced student or the advanced academic, but the average reader, the person who reads, you know, a good newspaper, you know, I mean, reads books, you know, buys books, goes to independent bookshops. That's the kind of reader. But that reader, I think, will gain a lot from just looking at a page and seeing all of the riches that are embedded in that page, which otherwise might be difficult to access if you don't have everything laid out the way it is here.
So Catherine, maybe you could speak to what you might think of as the, you know, the effect you might think this layout would have on a reader and that experience.
I'm just trying to identify what page it is.
It's, I think it's
Page 43.
Oh,
40.
great. Yeah, because I couldn't see, I was trying to zoom in. So yeah, so 43. So yeah, these, I mean, thanks for very helpfully talking about how this format works. That's the whole idea, that you have everything in this book that you need. And so typically the problem that readers have is that they fall between, you know, the two stools of just the book or too much annotation. You know, often you know, people buy Gifford and Seidman and they're just overwhelming. You know, there's so much going on that the notes go on forever, and it's like a kind of bog that people get lost in, a kind of swamp they fall into. I mean, it's very, very interesting, but you'll never read Ulysses. And then on the other hand, if you don't have anything, it can be very hard not to feel like you're just, not feel demoralized. So my idea was to give readers just enough notes at the bottom of the page to help them get through the book. So, and it's amazing how much you can squeeze in. Like on average, there's something like 150 words of notes at the bottom of every page. On a more difficult pages, there are more notes, and on easier pages, there are far fewer notes. So you can tell at a glance how, you know, rich with references and difficult vocabulary a page will be just at a glance. But in this one, we can see Stephen is on the beach in Proteus, and he's thinking about his cousin. He's thinking about his visit to Paris, and he's remembering Kevin Egan, who's obviously a kind of pseudonym of this Irish Fenian who's fled there, and he's thinking about all of the French things he used to say there. You know, the French beer, and demi-septier, a quarter pint, and the maid of all work, and so all of these French phrases are explained in the bottom. The vieille ogresse avec les dents jaunes, this idea of Queen Victoria as the old ogress with the yellow teeth, but also we get this explanation of the escape from Redmond Jail in 1865, James Stephen's alleged escape, where it was rumored that he got away in disguise as a young bride. So these are really fun stories and fun references. And it's always nice to read about Stephen in Paris, you know, even if it was a kind of unsuccessful trip. But you get a sense of the kind of smattering of his, or the sort of vagaries of his thoughts, and the kind of hodgepodge of references, and this very rich kind of textual fabric that he lives in. You know, the kind of stuff of his mind is extremely variegated, and so this is where handy reachable notes are really, I think, essential to some kind of appreciation. And I love Dan's idea that you'd read a page a night, because it really would be satisfying. It would be enough to bite into. And you could do it with this book. Just don't hold it over your head if you're sleepy, I would say. Might crush yourself. Yeah.
Well, you can maybe take a double course in literature and physical training with this volume. I mean, my own impression in encountering the page is, you know, when you're looking at, say, the Gabler edition, which is the teaching edition, there's a kind of icy, glacier-like monumentality that you're alone with that page, like some kind of, it's almost like the blank page of the writer's anxiety. But it's so colossal, it's so, the power dynamics are so strong. Here, you're not alone. It's like there's a conversation going on the sidelines, and you don't look it up, you look down and you see right away what you want to know. So it's like being companioned from within the text. And I find that really, really agreeable. And you know, just less alienating, or not alienating, not scarifying, but companioning.
Yeah. And, you know, it's interesting too, I think, to see the details that Joyce was really interested in. Like his correction there, you know, viewers might not see it. I had to open my own copy to read it. But the first note that Joyce makes is a correction of the word for Irishmen in French. And he doesn't want it capitalized, you know. He says for Irlandais, read Irlandais with the small I. And so I think that's a pretty interesting correction to make, you know.
Actually, that Irlandais gives me a seg into this next question. It's sort of the biggest question, and I think the most generative. And I'll start with you, Catherine. You know, as a scholar, you're working in kind of literary historical time. You're looking at the book in its own moment, and you've situated it in a memorable phrase as the self-articulation of a colonized country. Dan, you know, in a longer view, you know, drawing on your own global experience, Ulysses seems to emerge as something of a touchstone for Ireland in a new world order. You know, maybe even a tuning fork for the world as it might be. So I'm wondering, you know, that distinction is not necessarily a difference, let alone an antithesis. But I think I'm wondering if each of you could speak a bit more about your understanding of the place this novel takes in its world and in ours. And maybe then you could talk together about those several locations in time. You know, 1904, 2022. Dan, first.
Well, yes, look, 1904 for me is a fascinating choice. I mean, obviously Joyce made it for his own personal reasons, the year he met, or the time he met Nora Barnacle for the first time they walked out together. But historically, 1904 is exactly halfway between the death of Parnell and the Easter Rising. So there's something, for me, magical about that moment in time. So I see the novel as a kind of an exploration of Ireland on the cusp of dramatic political change, which happened 10 years later. I'm conscious that the novel was written at a time when that political change was taking place, and the Parnellite world was being banished, pushed out to the edges, vanquished by the kind of revived Sinn Féin after the Easter Rising in the election of 1918. I'm conscious of the fact that Joyce deliberately put into the novel where it was written and also the years in which it was written. So 1914, 1921. So in European terms, First World War and aftermath. In Irish terms, again, the revolutionary period. And I do think that Joyce was conscious of those things when he was writing his novel. I think there's a number of sort of hints in there that he understood that he was writing about an Ireland that was undergoing dramatic change. And then today, I think, for a long time, obviously, Ireland wasn't really a country that beat its breast with pride in the achievement of James Joyce's work. I think the change came, and I was involved at the very beginning, 1982, the centenary of Joyce's birth. That was the first time when really the Irish state embraced James Joyce. And I think since then, we have presented Joyce in a way as a kind of an epitome of the kind of Ireland that has become a reality over the last 30 years. And in particular, Joyce's European identity, his belief that Ireland needed to be more European, chimes with the Ireland that has become more European in the last 30 years, and even more so now because of the impact of Brexit, which brings us closer to our European partners in the European Union and a little bit further away from the influence of our nearest neighbor.
Catherine?
Yeah, and what a great contextualization. I mean, I think Joyce, to put it in a different way, he deliberately set this novel at a quiet time in Irish history. He wrote it during a spectacularly eventful time, but he sets it in 1904, a moment which I think Dan was suggesting is one of political stasis, stagnation, maybe despair for Ireland. And this was the moment where the parliamentary movement, parliamentarianism, had failed. And there wasn't yet the revolutionary energy that led to 1916, although it was circulating at the time that Joyce wrote the book. And also, the War of Independence, and then moving into the Civil War, but a little later. But so Joyce chose an ordinary moment. And I think that's very important for us reading it today, because we always feel like we're in an ordinary moment, even in our own lives. I mean, very few of us are ambassadors. And, we lead lives that are pretty mundane. And so this is a book about ordinary people living in a world that bears the weight of history, in which history has largely kind of dictated the terms of their lives and against which they have to live, or we have to live. So, Haynes tries to absolve English people, maybe, himself from blame when he says history, it seems, is to blame for what's happened to Ireland. He feels like he's trying not to make himself look unimportant or like a villain. But the challenge that Ulysses stages is the challenge of asserting yourself in a meaningful way, living your life in a meaningful way in the world, and the world as it is fully, not as created in some kind of genre novel, a science fiction novel, a romance novel, a travel novel. It's the world in all of its complexity, commerce, politics, death, romance, or love, family. There's so many different dimensions are brought to bear in this world, or registered in this world. And so this is why I think it's still so relevant for us, even though it's set now over 100 years ago, and Ireland has changed a huge amount, the world has changed a huge amount since then, but it's still the modern world in being a place that's overwhelming, largely because, not just because of the history that's gone before, but also because of these processes of dismantling that are going on, these modern processes in which tradition and convention are being shredded. And we're left with a sense of freedom, but also with a sense of feeling lost, being forced to come up with our own answers. And so I think for Joyce, the moment is the moment, that it's said at a particular historical moment, but it's always about the very moment in which you live. You know, Bloom's thoughts, they're always centered. He always returns to the now, and you know, returning to his sensations, to his perceptions, to the present. And this is, in a way, the big message of the book, you know, to wake up, to come back to yourself and to your immediate context, and to grapple with that.
Right. I just remember something I heard from a student writing an exam on Chaucer. Said Chaucer was sending a wake-up call to the world in 1395. But about time, it's about time. You know, it's a novel of the one day. It is a sort of subgenre in modern literature. I mean, Mrs. Dalloway does it, Untouchable does it. There are a lot of novels that become preoccupied with time. And if we think about the time of the novel and the time of history, if we think of, you know, the novel as history in miniature, and the day as an era, if you like, one of the great mistakes we have in reading history is reading history backwards, right? We read from where we are back to back then, and seeing it all sort of as an not untroubled, but certainly an inevitable progression to the present. And we edit out the thickness of the middle. And this book dwells richly in the thickness of the middle. It's in a force field of the just now, right here, right? And it's history, it's religion, it's psychology, it's envy, it's the 7 deadly sins plus 77 others. All of this is coming together so richly, and it makes sense, but it doesn't feel artificially sorted. You know, it feels lived forward in its complexity. That's why I think it isn't, you know, we don't feel propelled to some solution at the end that's going to pull it all together. I mean, the ending does do a tremendous thing. I mean, it's so overpowering, but like, you don't really sense it coming till about, you know, 30 lines before it's there. You know, it's surprising and delightful, and it seems like the necessary gift that you weren't expecting. So I mean, I think that, you know, this edition I think it helps us in all the ways we've been talking about here. I do have a couple of comments or questions from in the Q&A, and I'm wondering if we could just get your responses to this one. It's got some, it's maybe 50 words long, but I think it's worth it. It's from Donald Thurlow. Here is his comment. I think it comes, it's a way of response to our recent conversation about the politics and the history in the book. Leopold Bloom is the ultimate outsider. I moved to the UK in mid-60s as a 12-year-old. I experienced plenty of anti-Irish feeling and was part of a minority. Catholic, 8% of the population. My first reading of Ulysses was a great comfort and affirmation, particularly Cyclops. This is often replicated in discussions I have been part of in Dublin, Trieste, and Zurich. A good triangle there. So, Joyce as a comforter of the outsider. How about that? Dan, could you speak to that? Catherine,
yeah, that's that? I've been intrigued by the fact that he chose as his 3 main characters 3 outsiders. Bloom as a sort of a Jewish Hungarian background, suspected of being all sorts of terrible things, and Freemason, and so forth, and a man of ungenerous attitudes in the pub, and all these things, all these terrible transgressions against decency. And then you have Molly, who, after all, is half Spanish, and she's an exotic in the Ireland of the early 20th century. And then you have Stephen Dedalus, who's exotic for different reasons. Well, his name is exotic, as Malachi Mulligan reminds us, but also he's exotic in his kind of mindset, which is very, very different from the norm. So I do think that this is I've often been asked, why did Joyce choose to explore early 20th century Dublin through these 3 outsiders, these 3 untypical Irish people? I think that was the point. I think he wanted to do that because he wanted to have a way of stepping back from the world that he so elaborately paints in the novel, that he wanted to have people who could be a little bit of a bounce from that world. And I think that's why he did it. And also, if you think about it, he wrote this novel in 3 European cities, as he makes clear at the end of the novel. So again, there's this extraordinary approach of obsession with the Dublin of the early 20th century, while at the same time living his life in a very different environment in Trieste, a multicultural place where Bloom would not have been an outsider. Bloom would have been rather typical, maybe, a person, doing the rounds in Trieste at that time. So would Molly. Trieste was a very literary place. I think Stephen Dedalus would have fitted in well there, as well as indeed Joyce did. So I think there's something intriguing about this kind of outsider insider thing that we get in Ulysses, where we are being brought into the center of the forensically into the center of life in Dublin on a particular day in 1904, but at the same time it's being done through the experience of people who are comparative outsiders and written by somebody who is an outsider but attached to the country in a way that very few people could ever be at that time. I mean, how he managed to maintain a grip on what was happening in Ireland and on the reality of Ireland when he was so far away for so long has always intrigued me.
Yeah.
Catherine?
I think what's, Ulysses is, I love that idea that Joyce is the comforter of outsiders in Ulysses. And Bloom is the consummate outsider. He's not, he's, in a way, if he were born abroad, he would almost be less of an outsider. It's the fact that he's born in Dublin, but he's not accepted actually as Irish, that makes it really bitter, that really casts him in a kind of, as an excluded person. He's tolerated. He's in the carriage on the way to Hades, on the way to the graveyard in the Hades episode. But, there's so many little moments where he's outside of the conversation. And those aren't even the moments where they talk about suicide being a bad thing. Bloom's father killed himself. They talk about, Molly. They maybe don't know Molly's having an affair. But what I would say is that you could argue that every character in Ulysses is an outsider. Even the people who seem secure, all the men in the pub, say the men in the Cyclops episode, they're all kind of jockeying for position in the conversation. They're all trying to appear smart. There's a kind of, it's homosocial, this is the way that men of that kind love to be together. One person tries to be smarter than the other, and it's kind of fun. But there's a kind of, there is no real way of being an insider in Ireland. Partly it's to do with this semi-colonial status, like the Viceroy, weirdly, is presented as an outsider in Wandering Rocks. He makes this grand procession through the city, and Joyce slightly fictionalized the events around the Viceroy's journey from the lodge, the Viceregal Lodge in Phoenix Park, to the Mirrors Bazaar in Ballsbridge. He opened the bazaar. In real life, the Viceroy did that, but it was a much more low-key affair. There was no pomp and ceremonies across the city. Joyce really expands on that, but he does so in order to deconstruct that pomp. So he pays more attention, arguably, to minor characters than he does to the Viceroy. And in the end, what we end with the sturdy trousers of Almidano Artifoni disappearing behind a closing door. And so this is, an Italian Dubliner, an Italian Irishman who is entering his house and potentially belongs in Dublin more than the Viceroy does. And so this is a book that really takes apart any system that would allow people to feel secure, actually. And and this is, I think, why it's so powerful. We love Bloom as an outsider, but, maybe everyone is adrift in this book.
I think, it's a way of, there's a motive. I mean, why Joyce does this or that is a long story and maybe an uncertain story, but I think there's a consistent effort to estrange the familiar, right? and to de-essentialize anything, right? You know, the citizen supposedly knows who he is and why he is. Whereas I think everyone else, I think together you give us a sense that this novel sort of dwells way out in the center. Everyone is sort of disconnected from some, guaranteed understanding of who they are.
Yeah.
And
but the citizen's an actor as well. I mean, the citizen's he's a performance artist, really. He's there performing, and of course you also realize that he's not too popular down in County Tipperary because of his behavior down there at one point. So there's a lot of skeletons in the citizens cupboard as well that we kind of become vaguely aware of through Joyce's work.
Yeah, one of the comments in the Q&A observed that or asked if Bloom was the exiled Joyce, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. It is, after all, the title of the play too. So I see that Ray Ryan has re-entered the zone of the visible. And I think Ray's going to wrap us up. Is that right? Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Dan. And all the audience.
Well, it's been an absolutely engrossing hour, and I just want to thank everybody. We've had comments come in from Paris, Pakistan, Barcelona, Peru, from around US, and even from dear old Ireland. What can I say? We're thank you very much, Vince. Thank you very much, Dan. It's extraordinarily good of you in your schedule to make time for us. Most of all, I want to thank Catherine Flynn. Her wonderful eloquence, easy eloquence on the text is just a joy to hear. I think you'll all agree with me. She has a lovely voice as well, and explains one of the reasons why her podcast has been so wildly successful. Catherine, you're a voice for radio. It's lovely to listen to you. And you're a guide not just to the novel, but on how to live. I was enriched there at various levels. But look, this has been a special event. Here is the book again. It makes ideal summer reading the perfect Christmas gift, and no home should be without it. Wonderfully affordable price. I hope you all enjoy it as much as we have. Thank you very much to everybody.
It's a beach novel, after all. It's a beach novel published by Sylvia Beach.
And a beach umbrella too, right?
Thank you so much, Ray. I mean, really, thank you so much for your support with this project. It was really wonderful to have your backing with this and your recognition that this would work. I really appreciate that.
That's very kind of you. But the two stars of today have made it possible are Catherine and Joyce, and thank you very much for an engrossing hour, and once again to Vince, and perhaps especially, Vince will understand, to Ambassador Daniel Mulhall in an extraordinarily busy schedule to take the time to be with us today. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. I think we should applaud Catherine.
Well, thank you.